The galaxy exiled humanity, not realizing Earth had already prepared for this. The vote was already over when I walked into the chamber. I knew it before the doors opened. I knew it from the way the security escort kept 2 steps ahead of me instead of beside me. I knew it from the silence that fell the moment my boots touched the polished floor. 47 species, hundreds of delegates, and not one of them made a sound. That was unusual. The galactic conclave was never silent. It was a place of noise and motion and the constant hum of translation feeds. But when I entered, the room went as still as deep space. My name is Ines Vero. I was 41 years old. I had served as humanity's senior diplomatic representative for 11 years, and in that time I had sat through 612 formal sessions, 49 emergency hearings, and 1 war crimes tribunal that did not involve humans, though several delegates had tried hard to make it so. I had shaken hands with creatures that had no hands. I had drunk ceremonial liquids that tasted like engine coolant. I had smiled at beings who found human smiling deeply unsettling, and I had kept smiling anyway, because that was the job. The job, as of that morning, was finished. Delegate Harvin of the Veth Coalition stood at the central podium. The Veth were tall, pale-skinned, and deeply formal. Harvin had been my counterpart for 6 of my 11 years. We had eaten meals together. We had argued over treaty language at 3 in the morning with coffee between us. I had once helped him understand a human joke about a dog and a doorbell, and he had laughed, actually laughed, which Veth rarely did. I had considered him something close to a colleague. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes on the document in front of him and read the resolution aloud in the common tongue, which the translation feed delivered into my earpiece as flat and clean as a weather report. The charges were long. Unregulated expansion. Failure to comply with the Civilizational Development Index. Documented incidents of what the resolution called extreme adaptive behavior, which was the conclave's polite way of saying that humans kept surviving things that were supposed to destroy us. There were 3 appendices. I did not ask to see them. The vote came at the end. Each delegate pressed their seal. 47 seals. 47 small lights on the board behind the podium, each one turning from neutral gray to deep amber. I watched every single one. I did not look away. I wanted to see their faces when they did it. Most of them managed it with professional blankness. A few looked uncomfortable. One delegate from a species called the Shivari, a small, 4-armed people I had always liked, pressed his seal and then folded all 4 of his arms across his chest, which in their culture meant something like "I am sorry and there is nothing I can do about it." I appreciated that. I did not forgive it. But I appreciated it. 47 lights. 47 ambers. Harvin looked up from the podium for the first time. Our eyes met across the chamber floor, and I saw something in his face that surprised me. It was not satisfaction. It was not even relief. It was fear. Quiet, careful, well-managed fear that he was doing his best to keep from showing. He was afraid of what I would do next. I let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then I spoke. The translation feed carried my voice through every earpiece in the room. I kept my tone even. I did not raise my voice. I did not gesture or point or do any of the things that the conclave's behavioral consultants had once told me made humans look threatening. I said, "You should have checked what we had been doing for the last century." No one responded. No one asked what I meant. The security escort moved to my side. I turned and walked toward the exit doors at a normal pace, not fast and not slow, the same pace I used when walking to get coffee. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. I kept my face neutral. The doors opened. I stepped through. They closed behind me. The corridor outside was white and long and empty. My footsteps echoed. The escort fell into position behind me, and I noticed with some amusement that 2 of the 3 guards had increased their distance. Whatever Harvin's fear had been, it had apparently spread to the people around him. Good. A junior aide named Pete Cross was waiting for me at the transport bay. Pete was 26, sharp, and had the excellent quality of knowing when not to speak. He took one look at my face, handed me a sealed data pad, and fell into step beside me without a word. The transport pod was waiting with its hatch open. I stepped inside. Pete stayed on the platform. I looked back at him. He was one of the good ones. He had a family back on Earth. A daughter who had just turned 4. "Take the secondary transport," I told him. "Go home via the relay station." Do not use the primary conclave channels after tonight. He nodded once. He understood more than he let on. That was also one of his good qualities. I sat down in the transport pod and the hatch sealed. The pod moved into its launch tube. In 11 seconds it would enter the transit corridor and begin the 18-hour journey back to the solar system's edge. I had 11 seconds. I opened the secured communication panel beneath the seat, entered a 14-digit authorization code, placed my palm on the biometric reader, and then pressed a single key marked with a small yellow circle. One word transmitted. No encryption header, no recipient address, no authentication trail. Just the word, broadcast on a frequency that the conclave did not monitor because it did not know the frequency existed. Sundown. The pod launched. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes, and for the first time in 11 years I let myself breathe without calculating what the breath looked like. I was 12 years old when Earth made first contact. I was sitting in my grandmother's kitchen in a small city on the coast of Spain, eating toast, when the broadcast interrupted every screen on the planet. My grandmother, Dr. Camila Vero, was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee. She watched the broadcast for about 40 seconds. Then she set her cup down very carefully and said, in her quiet and precise way, "Let us see how long they trust us." I had not known then what she meant. I knew now. I had known for a long time. The pod hummed around me. The stars outside the small porthole were steady and cold and beautifully indifferent. Somewhere behind me, in that white chamber with its 47 amber lights, the conclave was already moving forward. Claiming spaces. Reordering agreements. Doing the administrative work of a universe that no longer included humanity. They were very busy. They had no idea how little that mattered. I pulled the datapad from my jacket and entered the unlock sequence. The file that opened was labeled Meridian Archive, Personal Copy, Authorization, Vero. It was 340 pages long. I had read it many times. I knew every line. But I opened it to the first page anyway, because what came next would be easier with the words in front of me. The first line read, Scenario 7, Civilizational Rejection. Probability rating, high. Contingency status, active. I had 11 years of careful work behind me. I had 18 hours ahead of me. And somewhere out in the dark between the stars, in places the conclave had never mapped and never thought to look, the real work had already been done. The transport pod moved through the dark. I started reading. I read for 4 hours before I stopped, not because I was tired but because the words had moved from memory into something older. I knew the Meridian Archive well enough that reading it felt less like learning and more like remembering who I actually was beneath 11 years of careful performance. Outside the porthole, the stars did not move. That was one of the strange things about space travel. You went extraordinary distances and the view barely changed. The same cold points of light, the same black backdrop, the same sensation that you were sitting perfectly still while the universe rearranged itself around you. That had always seemed like a good description of what humanity had been doing for the past century. The Meridian Archive began 72 years ago. That was important. 72 years was not a recent decision. It was not a response to the exile vote. It was not something my generation had built in a panic when the diplomatic signals started turning cold. It was a plan written before most of the people currently alive on Earth had been born, written by a small group of scientists, strategists, and historians who had looked at first contact not with wonder but with clear professional calculation. The group had been led by my grandmother. Dr. Camila Vero had been 43 when Earth received the first confirmed signal from the Veth Coalition. She had spent the previous 20 years studying the history of every contact event humanity had ever theorized about, every model, every simulation, every academic paper going back 150 years. When the real signal arrived, she did not celebrate. She called an emergency meeting of her research group and said, very simply, we have approximately 30 years before they decide what to do with us. Let us use them well. What followed was a document called the Meridian Review. It was not classified for the first decade. It sat in academic archives, cited occasionally, mostly ignored. Its central argument was straightforward: any species that survived long enough to travel between stars had done so by developing strong in-group survival mechanisms. Those mechanisms did not disappear upon meeting other species. They adapted. The most likely long-term outcome of galactic contact was not war and it was not partnership. It was sorting, the powerful defining the terms, the newcomers accepting them or being removed. Humanity, the review argued, needed a third option. The third option had a name. It was called the Scatter Protocol. I first read the full protocol text when I was 29, newly assigned to the diplomatic corps, pulled into a secure room by a woman named Director Lena Ford, who had the manner of someone who had been carrying a very large secret for a very long time and was relieved to finally share part of it. Lena had set a printed copy on the table between us and said, "Before you go to Chorus Prime, you need to understand what you are really doing there." What I was really doing there was performing. Everything humanity showed the Galactic Conclave was a version of ourselves that had been carefully constructed to appear manageable. Our faster-than-light drives were presented as Generation 2 technology, functional but limited, still being refined, nothing to concern anyone. In reality, we had been flying Generation 4 since before I was born. Our colony ships were called experimental. Our research stations were called preliminary. Our defense systems were called theoretical. None of that was true. The ships were not experimental. The stations were not preliminary. The research was not theoretical. They were all real and they were all fully operational, and they were positioned in places that the Conclave had no records of, because we had never told the Conclave they existed. This was not an accident. It was architecture. The Scatter Protocol was built on one simple observation from my grandmother's original review: the Conclave did not know what it did not know. It had mapped human space based on what we had shown them. It had assessed human capability based on what we had demonstrated. It had made its decision to exile us based on a picture of humanity that was true in its details and completely false in its scope. The Conclave had voted to remove a performance. The real humanity had never been in the room. I set the data pad on my knee and looked out at the stars for a moment. The transport was past the outer marker buoys now, into open space, heading for the relay point that would flip me into the transit corridor. 11 hours remaining. I thought about Harvin. I thought about the fear in his face. He was right to be afraid. Not because I was going to do anything to him. I was not. The Scatter Protocol was not about revenge, and my grandmother had been very clear on that point in the documents she left behind. Revenge was small thinking. Revenge was the logic of someone who believed the conflict was personal. This was not personal. This was civilizational. Harvin was afraid because, on some level, he had felt it. Not known it, not understood it, but felt it the way you feel a current in water before you can see where it is going. He had spent 6 years across a table from me, and something in him had noticed that I was never quite as worried as I should have been. That when the votes went against us, I did not fight hard enough. That when the negotiations closed doors, I did not seem to be looking for windows. He had assumed it was resignation. It was patience. The Scatter Protocol had 3 stages. The first was preparation, which had taken 40 years. The second was positioning, which had taken 20 more. The third was activation, which began the moment I pressed that key on the communication panel and sent the word sundown into a frequency no one else was listening to. I opened the archive to the section on the scatter nodes. There were 140 of them. They had been built quietly over 60 years, moving slowly outward from the solar system along paths that avoided conclave sensor lanes. Each node was a self-sustaining colony, fully stocked, fully staffed, with its own government structure, its own resource economy, and its own defense capability. The smallest had a population of 200,000. The largest, a colony called Ardennes, orbiting a yellow star 420 light-years from Sol, had nearly 30 million people who had been born there, grown up there, built their whole lives there, and never once appeared in a conclave population register. They had never been registered because we had never told the conclave about them. The scatter nodes were not secret because we were hiding something shameful. They were secret because my grandmother had understood, 72 years ago, that a species in our position had one window of opportunity. The window was the period between first contact and the point at which the established powers decided what category to put us in. Once the category was fixed, it was almost impossible to change. The history of every galactic species the conclave had ever absorbed proved that point. The window lasted approximately 1 human generation. My grandmother had used it well. I scrolled to the section on the patience doctrine. This was the part one had always found most interesting, because it was the part that was hardest to execute. It was one thing to build ships in secret. It was another thing to walk into a room full of beings who were deciding your future and behave like someone who had options, while looking like someone who did not. The patience doctrine was a training program. It applied to every human who would work in galactic-facing roles: diplomats, traders, scientists, cultural liaisons. The core principle was simple but demanding: never negotiate to win. Negotiate to continue. Every argument you win too easily teaches the other side that you are capable of winning. Every concession you make that costs you nothing teaches them that you have things to spare. The goal is not agreement. The goal is time. I had spent 11 years executing the patience doctrine. I had lost arguments I could have won. I had accepted terms I did not need to accept. I had smiled at beings who looked at me with open contempt and thanked them for their consideration. It had been, at times, deeply unpleasant. It had also worked. The conclave had made its decision confident that they were dealing with a young, reactive, somewhat dangerous but ultimately manageable species that had no real alternatives. They had exiled us the way you clear a minor complication from a schedule, efficiently, completely, and without any expectation that the complication would have something to say about it. The transport passed through the relay point. The stars outside the porthole shifted as the transit corridor locked in. 14 hours remaining. I read the last page of the Meridian Archive for the 100th time. It was a personal note, not an official document. My grandmother had written it in Spanish, and it had been translated for the archive, but I had always preferred the original. The final line, in her handwriting, read: "We do not need the galaxy's permission. We only need enough time." She had died 8 years before the exile vote. She never knew how it ended. But she had built it so well, and with such careful love for every human who would come after her, that the ending was almost inevitable from the beginning. I closed the archive. I looked out at the stars. Sundown was active. The nodes were dark to external sensors. The long performance was over. And ahead of me, in the dark between stars that the conclave had never thought to map, 140 colonies were waking up to the same message I had sent from that transport pod, and beginning the next phase of something my grandmother had started before I was born. I allowed myself one small, private smile. Then I closed my eyes and slept for the first time in 3 days, because what came next was going to require me to be fully awake. I arrived at Varda on a Tuesday. That was the day the colony used. They had kept Earth's 7-day week, and this particular Tuesday had a strong wind coming off the eastern plains that smelled like dry grass and something faintly metallic, the way all young planets do when their soil chemistry is still settling in. I stood at the landing platform exit for a moment and breathed it in. Varda orbited a red dwarf called Ross for something. The astronomers had a full designation, but nobody used it. The sun sat low and heavy in the sky, large and deep orange, and it painted everything in warm amber light that made the whole city look like late afternoon even at midday. The buildings were low and wide, built in the practical style of colonies that had not yet decided they had enough stability to build for beauty. But there were trees planted along the main boulevard, imported earth trees, oak and birch, tall enough now to make real shade, and flower boxes on the market stalls, and children running between the stalls without looking where they were going. 12 million people lived on Varda. None of them had ever appeared in a conclave census. Colonel Dan Phelps was waiting for me at the base of the platform steps. Dan was 54, built like someone who had spent his whole life doing physical work, with a gray-shot beard he had apparently decided not to deal with, and the particular stillness of a person who had been managing serious things for a long time and was very used to it. He had commanded Varda's orbital defense network for 9 years. We had spoken via secure channel many times. We had never met in person. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "You look shorter than I expected." I said, "Everyone says that." He almost smiled. He said, "Your transmission reached us 14 hours ago. The council is assembled." The other nodes confirmed receipt within the first 3 hours. "All 140, I said. "All 140, he confirmed. We walked. Varda's streets were busy in the way of a colony that had work to do and not quite enough hours in the day to do it. Traders and mechanics and farmers and technicians and the small army of people it takes to run a city of 12 million. They did not know who I was. To them I was just another arrival from the transport lines, someone with a travel bag and slightly tired eyes. I liked that. I liked the anonymity of it. For 11 years I had never walked anywhere on Chorus Prime without being watched. The council chamber was inside a low administrative building near the city center. It had the same practical, unpretty architecture as everything else on Varda: white walls, high ceilings, good lighting. 9 people sat at a round table. They had different ages, different looks, different histories, but they had one quality in common: they were all completely calm. That was the Varda quality. That was the scatter protocol quality. These were people who had known, all their lives, that something like this moment was coming. They had been told. Their parents had been told. They had grown up with it the same way Earth children grew up with the knowledge of history, not as an alarm but as a context. Sundown was not a shock to them. It was a beginning they had been expecting. I sat down. I set the data pad on the table. I said, Sundown is active as of 31 hours ago. The conclave exile vote was unanimous. The performance is over. The council looked at me in silence for a moment. Then a woman named Claire Bond, who ran Varda's resource network and had the manner of someone who had calculated everything twice, said, "What does that change for us operationally?" I said, "Nothing that was not already planned." I walked them through the activation sequence. All 140 nodes had gone dark to external sensors on receipt of the Sundown transmission. Any conclave probe or survey vessel that passed through the scatter zone in the next 6 to 12 months would find nothing. The nodes did not broadcast. They did not use any communication frequency that the conclave monitored. To the outside galaxy, the scatter zone was empty. This was not new. The nodes had been running dark protocols since their founding. What was new was that the protocols were now permanent rather than precautionary. Dan Phelps asked about the conclave survey fleet. I told him what I knew. Conclave intelligence had shown 3 active survey vessels operating in the outer scatter boundary zone, the section nearest to known conclave space. They were using standard long-range probes. They had not found anything yet. They were moving slowly. I said, "They will find something eventually." Dan said, "How long?" I said, "Months. A year. Maybe 2 if we are lucky. But they will find it. We should not plan around them not finding it." Claire Bond said, "What do we do when they do?" I looked at her. This was the question that the scatter protocol had always carried at its heart. My grandmother had not answered it directly. She had written that decision belongs to the generation that faces it. We can only give them the strength to face it well. I said, "We do not hide. We do not run. We talk. But this time, we talk on equal terms." A younger man at the end of the table, Oliver Crane, he ran Varda's shipyard administration, and could not have been more than 30, leaned forward and said, "So what does that mean? What do we actually do now, practically, tomorrow?" I looked at him. He had an eager, direct quality that I liked immediately. I said, "We stop pretending." He blinked. He said, "That's it." I said, "That is the whole thing." For 70 years, every human who faced the conclave performed a version of ourselves that was smaller and simpler and less capable than the truth. We did it deliberately and we did it well. And now we do not do it anymore. The nodes continue their operations without cover stories. The shipyards run at full capacity. The communication networks expand on their own terms. We build what we want to build. We go where we want to go. I paused. I said, "The galaxy exiled a performance. The real version of humanity has never introduced itself." Oliver Crane sat back in his chair. He looked at the table for a moment and then out through the narrow windows at the amber-lit street outside, where the ordinary machinery of a colony's day was continuing without any awareness of this conversation. He said, quietly, "I think I understand now why they were afraid of us." I said, "They were afraid of us because, on some level, they knew. They never understood what they were seeing, but they felt it. They looked at us and something in them recognized that the numbers did not add up. That we were too calm. That we lost arguments too gracefully. That we never seemed truly desperate, even when we should have been." The council sat with that for a moment. Then Dan Phelps said, "What about the survey vessels?" I said, "We watch them. We let them find what they find. And when they do, I will be there to take the call." I left the council chamber 2 hours later and walked back through Varda's streets toward the transit quarters. The amber light was lower now, the shadow of the trees longer. The market stalls were beginning to pack up. Children were being called home for meals. 12 million people on this world alone. 30 million on Ardennes. 200,000 on the smallest node. 140 nodes in total. The math was not small. Back in my transit room, I checked the incoming channel reports. The conclave's public broadcasts were full of administrative announcements. New territory resolutions. Adjusted trade corridor maps. The business of a galaxy that had just removed a member and was redistributing the space it had occupied. I found it interesting that they had moved so quickly. They had held the exile vote at 9 in the morning. By 4 in the afternoon, the territory resolution was filed. By the following morning, 3 separate species had submitted formal claims to regions that human survey teams had been operating in. They had prepared those claims in advance. That meant they had known the vote was coming before I had been called to the chamber. That meant the 47 ambers on that board had not been a deliberation. They had been a performance of their own. The galaxy had prepared its exit paperwork before the hearing began. I sat with that thought for a long time. Outside, Varda's long amber evening was fading into its slow red star night. The stars were coming out, different stars here than Earth's, close enough to feel personal after enough years, far enough to remind you that you were somewhere entirely new. I thought of my grandmother standing at her kitchen counter with her coffee. I thought of the word she had said, "Let us see how long they trust us." It turned out, about 30 years. But we had used every one of them. The conclave survey vessel dropped out of transit 400 kilometers above Ardennes on a Wednesday morning local time. I know the exact time because I was in the shipyard control center when the proximity alert sounded, and the timestamp was 0714 Ardennes Standard. I had been awake since 0400. I had not slept well on Ardennes. The gravity was slightly higher than Varda, slightly higher than Earth, and my body had not adjusted. I had been on Ardennes for 3 months. The survey vessel was Veth Registry, which was not a surprise. The Veth had the largest and most capable survey fleet in the conclave, and the outer scatter boundary was exactly the kind of territory their exploration division liked. They went into unknown space the way other species went to academic conferences, with careful preparation, detailed methodology, and a deep professional pride in the documentation. The name of the vessel was the Veth Civil Explorer Designation 11, which the translation feed rendered as Open Hand of Inquiry. That name was going to become briefly famous. I stood in the control center and watched the tactical display. Ardennes' orbital defense network had locked the vessel the moment it completed its transit, not aggressively, not with weapon systems active, but with the quiet, complete mechanical attention of a defense grid that knew exactly where everything was and wanted the visitor to know that it also knew. The survey vessel's engines went to station keeping immediately. That was either a sign of good training or a sign that they had felt the lock. Probably both. Dan Phelps was on Varda. The senior defense officer on Ardennes was a woman named Helen Cross, no relation to Pete, who had been running the orbital network here for 7 years. She came to stand beside me and said, without any particular emotion, "They are hailing." I said, "I know. Put it through." The communication screen opened. The Veth Admiral on the other end was named, according to the identification header that came through with the signal, First Survey Marshal Coven. He was older than Harvin. He had the Veth coloring, the pale skin, the very precise posture, and the careful expression of someone who had just seen something that did not match any of his existing data. He looked at the tactical display feed. He looked at the 30 million people registered on Ardennes' population network, the number that had appeared automatically in the data handshake the moment he got close enough for standard first contact protocols to engage. 30 million. On a world that did not exist in any conclave catalog. He looked at me. He said, "How long has this been here?" I said, "Longer than you have been watching us." There was a silence. It was a very specific kind of silence, the kind that happens when a person's mind is running very fast but their face has not yet caught up. He said, "This colony is not registered with the Conclave Settlement Authority." I said, "No." He said, "There are no records of this system in the Conclave Survey database." I said, "Also no." Another silence. He said, "May I ask how large this settlement is?" I said, "You have the data handshake figure. 30 million permanent residents. The colony has been continuously occupied for 41 years. I watched him absorb that. 41 years. This world had been full of human beings for 41 years, and the conclave had never known. He said, "Is this the only one?" I let the silence sit for exactly 4 seconds. I had learned, in 11 years of diplomacy, that silences have length and weight, and that how you use them tells the other person more than the words that come before and after. Then I said, "No." He was very good. Most Veth diplomats and officers were trained to a high level of composure. But I saw it, just briefly, just around the eyes, the thing that Harvin had shown in the chamber. That quiet, well-managed fear. He said, "How many?" I said, "Enough." I said it without any particular emphasis. Not as a threat. Not as a boast. Just as a fact, the way you would say the temperature or the distance to the next star. He said, the conclave exile resolution was filed 4 months ago. This colony predates it by decades. You are claiming these were not built in response to the exile. I said, we are not claiming it. It is true. The scatter network, that is what we call it, has been under development for 60 years. The planning document that initiated it was written 72 years ago. The exile resolution was, from our perspective, a confirmation that the planning had been correct. Another silence. He said, your people planned for this before most of the current conclave leadership was born. I said, my grandmother planned for it. I implemented part of it. The people who built these colonies built the rest. It was a long project. First Survey Marshal Coven looked off screen for a moment. I could not see what he was looking at. He was talking to someone. I could see the small movement of his lips, the slight turn of his head. His crew, his superiors via relay, both. He was getting guidance in real time. I waited. I was good at waiting. Helen Cross, standing beside me, did not move or speak. She had the quality of a person who understood that the right thing to do right now was nothing. Coven came back on screen. He said, I have been asked to relay a formal request from the Conclave High Council. They are requesting an emergency session regarding these discoveries. I said, I am sure they are. He said, will humanity participate? I said, humanity will participate. On our terms, at a location of our choosing, on a timeline that works for us. He said, the council was expecting. I said, the council was expecting a great many things that are no longer accurate. I understand that adjustment takes time. We will be in touch through formal channels with the session parameters. I paused. Then I said, Marshal Coven. He said, yes. I said, I want to be clear about something. We are not angry. We are not here to cause harm or instability. What happened in the chamber 4 months ago was a decision that the conclave made, and we understand why they made it. They made it based on the information they had. The problem is that the information they had was incomplete. We allowed that incompleteness because we needed the time. We have the time now. I said, what comes next is a conversation. A real one, between equal parties, with full information on the table. That is all we want. A conversation that nobody arranges in advance before we walk into the room. Coven was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a slightly different voice, a slightly more human voice, if that was the right word, he said, you knew about the pre-filed territory claims. I said, we knew the vote was decided before I entered the chamber. Yes. He said, I want you to know that I did not know that. I looked at him. I believed him. Not because Veth officers were inherently honest, but because the particular tone of what he had just said had the sound of something that had been sitting uncomfortably in his chest for 4 months. I said, I know. He said, is that why you look so calm? I said, I look calm because I am calm. Marshal, I have been working toward this moment for 11 years. The hard part was keeping quiet. The conversation is the easy part. He made a small sound that might have been, in Veth expression, the equivalent of a reluctant laugh. He said, I will file my survey report tonight. I expect the High Council will be in contact within 48 hours. I said, we will be ready for them. The channel closed. Helen Cross let out a long breath through her nose. She said, that went better than I expected. I said, the first contact always does. It is the third and fourth meetings that get complicated. I walked to the window. Ardennes spread below the orbital station, visible through the viewport as a curve of blue and green and brown, a planet that had been home to 30 million people for 41 years and was only now introducing itself to the wider galaxy. I thought of Oliver Crane on Varda, asking what do we do now? I thought of the answer I had given him. We stopped pretending. This was what that looked like. It was not a battle. It was not a confrontation. It was a planet, existing openly, being exactly what it was, and letting the people who had chosen to remove us deal with the math of what that meant. 30 million on Ardennes. 12 million on Varda. 200,000 on the smallest node. And 138 more worlds between those extremes. The conclave had exiled a species of 8 billion people spread across one solar system. What they had not known was that there was a second humanity, older in some ways, newer in others, spread across 140 worlds, fully capable, fully present, and done waiting for permission to exist. I pulled out my personal recorder. I pressed the key. I said, "Grandmother." It worked. They found us. I put the recorder away. Outside the viewport, our den turned slowly in the light of its star, warm and green and completely, thoroughly real. The summit was held 6 months later. It took that long because of 3 things. First, the conclave needed time to discover the full scope of what they were dealing with, and each discovery required a period of adjustment that the High Council was not always graceful about. Second, we needed time to decide exactly what we wanted to say and how we wanted to say it. And third, there was the matter of the location. We would not meet on Chorus Prime. I had stated that clearly in the first formal message we sent after Coven filed his report. The chamber with its raised tiers and its 47 amber lights was not neutral ground. It was the conclave's room, built to the conclave's proportions, laid out in a way that placed the established members above the people they were speaking to. We had sat in that arrangement for 30 years. We were not going back. The location we proposed was a decommissioned relay station called Station 11, orbiting a dim star in a region that had never been formally claimed by any species. It was halfway between conclave core space and the outermost scatter nodes. It was, technically, nobody's property. The conclave agreed after 11 days of back and forth. That was faster than I had expected. I arrived at Station 11 aboard an Ardennes transport, accompanied by a delegation of 7, 3 from the scatter node councils, 2 technical experts, 1 historian named Walter Good who had spent 30 years documenting everything, and a young communications officer named Lyra West who had grown up on Varda and had never been to Earth. Lyra was 23. She had been picked, in part, because I wanted the conclave to see that the humans in this room were not all people who remembered the original exile. Some of them had been born into something larger. The station had been cleaned and supplied but not decorated. Gray corridors, working lights, functional meeting tables. It looked like what it was, a working space for a working conversation. The conclave delegation arrived 2 hours after we did. 41 species represented, 6 fewer than the original exile vote. 5 species had sent regrets. 1 species, the Keth, had sent no response at all. Harvin was there. I had not known if he would be. The Veth had sent him as their senior representative, which told me something about their internal politics. Either Harvin had influence, or he was being offered up as a sacrifice to his own knowledge of what had gone wrong. Probably both. He came to me before the session opened, while the delegations were still taking their seats. He said, "Commander Vero." I said, "Delegate Harvin." He said, "I owe you an explanation." I said, "You owe me nothing. You owed me honesty in that chamber, and you did not give it. That is the past. Today is different." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I want you to know that I argued against the exile resolution." I said, "I know. We intercepted the internal council records. Your dissent is noted." He blinked. Then, slowly, he almost smiled. He said, "You intercepted the internal council records." I said, "We had 11 years and a very good technical team." He shook his head slightly. He said, "You are not at all what we thought you were." I said, "No, we are not." That was the point. He went to take his seat. I went to take mine. The chamber had a round table, which was our second precondition. No elevated tiers. No hierarchy of seating. Everyone at the same height, facing each other across the same surface. The third precondition had been about agenda. There would be no resolution, no vote, and no document filed with the Conclave Settlement Authority without full agreement from the human delegation. Nothing would be decided for us. Nothing would be decided about us without us. The Conclave had accepted all 3 conditions. That told me something about how thoroughly Coven's report had landed. I opened the session myself. I did not have notes. I had lived with this speech long enough that notes were not necessary. I said, "We are here because there was a misunderstanding. I want to be precise about the nature of that misunderstanding, because precision matters in conversations that are meant to last." I said, "The misunderstanding was not that you exiled us. You made that decision based on the information you had, through your standard processes, and it produced the outcome you intended. I understand how the result happened. I do not dispute the process." I said, the misunderstanding was that you believed you knew us. You had 30 years of contact data, 30 years of meetings and trade agreements and cultural exchanges and incident reports. You believed that data was complete. It was not. We allowed it to be incomplete because we needed the time that the performance gave us. I said, what I am here to offer is completion. Full information. The real numbers, the real map, the real capability profile of the human species as it actually exists today. Not the version we performed for 3 decades. The real version. There was a silence in the room. Then a delegate from a species called the Taravan were small and quick, fast thinkers who tended to process things out loud, said, why did you wait? If you had this capacity all along, why did you not simply present it at first contact? Why the performance? It was a fair question. It was the question I had been expecting. I said, because you would not have believed us. And more importantly, you would not have been ready for us. I said, consider the position of any established galactic civilization when a new species arrives. The established species has norms, structures, hierarchies, and arrangements that have developed over long periods of time. A new species with significant capability is a disruption to all of those arrangements. The natural response is not welcome. It is management. Control. Reduction. We had read your history. We had studied every first contact event the Conclave had ever experienced. In 31 out of 31 cases, the result was the same: the new species was categorized, assigned a status, and integrated into an existing hierarchy on terms set entirely by the existing members. I said, we did not want those terms. We also could not fight them on day one. We were genuinely new. We needed time to become what we were capable of becoming. So we performed something smaller while the real work continued quietly. Another delegate, this one from a species called the Wren, who had been in the Conclave for over 1,000 years and had a reputation for asking very direct questions, said, the question I have is a simple one. You have more ships than we do. You have more people than we knew. You have technology you never disclosed. What is to stop you from simply taking what you want? I looked at the Wren delegate. The name in the translation feed was Elder Bova. Elder Bova was very old, with the blue-gray skin of the Wren at their most senior, and eyes that had the quality of having seen a very large number of things without being surprised by many of them. I said, nothing stops us. That is the honest answer. We have the capability to take a great many things. We have chosen not to because taking is not the point. I said, the point is this. The galaxy is large. Resources are not scarce at any scale that matters. What is scarce is trust, and what is rarer than trust is the kind of arrangement that does not require constant management and enforcement to survive. We do not want conquest. Conquest is a maintenance problem. We want something more durable. Elder Bova said, and what is that? I said, an agreement between species that actually reflects the reality of what everyone is capable of. Not a hierarchy based on who arrived first. Not a ranking system based on civilizational age. An actual conversation between parties who know what they are dealing with. I said, you exiled a species you believed was manageable. You discover now that the species was never manageable in the way you imagined, and that the exile simply moved a performance off your stage while the real thing continued in the dark. That is an unstable situation. It produces uncertainty. It produces the kind of fear I saw in Delegate Harvan's face when the vote was over. I said, what I am offering is stability. Not because we want to be generous. Because stability is genuinely better for everyone, including us. A galaxy where every new species has to hide what it is in order to avoid being crushed is a galaxy that is always operating on incomplete information, always making decisions based on a false picture. That is bad strategy for everyone at the table. I let the room sit with that. Then a younger delegate, a Veth, not Harvan, someone I did not recognize, raised her seal and said, you said this new framework would require full disclosure of military capacity from all parties. Not just humanity. All parties. I said, yes. She said, the Conclave has never operated on full disclosure. The established members have always reserved the right to maintain classified capabilities. I said, I know. That was the system as it existed. I am suggesting a different system. She said, you are suggesting that the species that have held the balance of power in this galaxy for 900 years open their strategic files to a newcomer that just revealed it has been hiding its real capability for 3 decades. I said, yes. Another silence. I said, I understand that seems unreasonable. I am asking you to consider it not as a demand but as a question. A question that runs something like this: if the current system is one where everyone hides what they are, and the result of that is a galaxy where the exile of a new species only disperses them into a larger network that you never knew existed, then is the current system actually serving anyone's interests? Or is it just familiar? Elder Bova made a sound. It took the translation feed a moment to render it. It came through as, that is an uncomfortable question. I said, yes. It is. I have been sitting with it for 11 years. The session ran for 9 hours that day. It ran for 6 hours the following day, and 4 hours the day after that. I will not recount every exchange. The important ones were the ones that happened in the corridors between sessions, the ones that do not appear in any formal record, delegates coming to find me quietly, asking questions they did not want to ask in the room. A delegate from the Shovari found me on the second evening. Small, four-armed, folding all four arms when she sat down across from me in the corridor lounge. This was the gesture I had learned meant I am sorry and there is nothing I can do about it. She said, I pressed my seal. I said, I know. She said, I want you to know what the pressure was like. I said, I already know. You do not need to tell me. You are here now. That counts. She looked at me with her forearm fold still in place. She said, my people have been in the conclave for 400 years. We have never voted against a resolution that had 46 other supporters. We would not have survived as a small species for 400 years by making the kind of enemy. I said, I understand entirely. What you did was rational. She said, then why do I feel badly about it? I said, because rational and right are not always the same thing. The feeling you have is worth paying attention to. It is telling you something about the system you have been surviving in for 400 years. She thought about that. Then she said, if your framework passes, would there be protections for small species? The kind that currently survive by staying quiet. I said, that is exactly the kind of protection it would include. It was built with that in mind. She came to the third day of sessions. On the third day, Walter Good, my historian, presented a document he had spent 30 years writing. It was the full account of the scatter protocol, from my grandmother's original review through every node, every ship, every decision point. It was the most comprehensive document about humanity ever assembled in one place, and it was given to every delegation in the room, unencrypted, in their own translation format. The room was very quiet while they read the summary pages. I watched their faces. I had gotten good at reading species I had not evolved to read, after 30 years of practice. What I saw was not what I had expected. I had expected more fear. There was some. But more than that, there was something that in humans would look like recognition. The slow, uncomfortable arrival of a truth that some part of you has already sensed. They had known. They had all known, on some level, that the picture did not add up. That we were too stable, too strategic, too patient for the story we were telling about ourselves. They had let themselves not know because not knowing was easier. Now they knew. On the third day, when the session opened for the final document review, the Shovari delegate came in with all four arms unfolded. 31 species signed the Meridian Accords on the fourth day. The Accords were named after my grandmother's original document, which I had insisted on. The name was in the preamble, with a full citation. Dr. Camila Vero, Earth, Sol System. The woman who had started all of this. The remaining 10 species in the room signed within the following 2 months. The Keth never responded. 6 months later, they sent a trade inquiry. I filed it under in progress. On the evening of the fourth day, after the signatures were done and the formal session was closed, Lyra West, my 23-year-old communications officer from Varda, who had never been to Earth, who had grown up on a world that the Conclave had never heard of, came to find me at the viewport at the end of the station corridor. She said, "May I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What do we do now? I mean actually, going forward, what are we?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "That is the thing we get to decide. For the first time, with everyone at the table knowing who we actually are." She said, "That is a good answer." I said, "It is your grandmother's answer." She said something similar a very long time ago. Lyra looked out through the viewport at the dim star and the dark around it. She said, "I never thought I would be here for something like this." I said, "None of us did." Not really. We prepared. But preparing for a thing and standing inside it are very different experiences. That night, alone in my transit room, I took out my personal recorder. I pressed the key. I said, "Grandmother. We signed the accords today. 31 species, with more coming." They all read the full document. They know who we are now. The real version. I stopped. I thought about what to say next. I said, "They called it a sentence, abuela. What you built, what I tried to execute, what 140 worlds built quietly in the dark for 60 years, they handed it to us like it was an ending. Like it was the last word." I said, "We called it a head start." I sat with the recorder for a while longer without speaking. Outside the viewport, the dim star turned. The station hummed around me. Somewhere behind me, in a conference room still warm from 9 hours of conversation, 31 sets of signatures sat drying on the most important document in human history, written in languages my grandmother had never learned, on a station that had not existed when she put her coffee cup down and said, "Let us see how long they trust us." The answer was 30 years. And we had used every single one. I pressed stop on the recorder. I put it in my jacket pocket and sat for a long time looking at the star. Then I got up, because there was a great deal of work still to do, and I had always been good at working. The galaxy had exiled humanity. It had not realized that we had already left.